So going into the Lord of Hatred expansion, you may have noticed that uniques are very, very different. The biggest thing you'll have noticed is that uniques are now almost completely randomly rolled affixes. I know some of them or all of them will have like one stat they always have on them, but everything else is completely randomly rolled, meaning uniques are probably the hardest thing to farm for your builds now, because you want to get that unique, as ancestral, then you want to get that unique with, say, at least a couple good greater affixes, and then you want to have all of the rolls be somewhat decent. That just gets harder and harder and harder to get as you're trying to get better and better rolled unique items. But that's actually not the only reason why some uniques are so incredibly hard to farm, because there are actually a pretty long list of unique items that are now not specific to any layer boss, so there's no place to go target farm these items. In fact, there's about a dozen and a half unique items that are very hard to farm now because they can't be target farmed from any of the layer bosses. So in this video, I want to go over the best way to target farm any unique in the game. This includes trying to get these much more rare unique items. Now, before we go into this method, I want to just give you an example of one of the items I've personally been searching for and how rare some of these generic unique items can be if you're not using the method in this video. And this is the thundergod's blessing, which is a unique ring that's only for, I think, 3 classes. It's Druid, Sorcerer, and I think Spiritborn. But this ring is pretty good. Its special effect is lightning damage against close enemies, has a 25% chance to grant resolve, and up to 300% increased multiplicative damage. So specifically for playing a druid like I'm doing, there are a handful of builds where this thing would be ridiculously strong for just playing the game, and I have, I think, over 100 hours of this expansion so far, all on a druid, or mostly on a druid, and just playing the game normally. I have found this ring a total of 1 time, and it was not ancestral. I have one of these rings, or let's say I had one of these rings. So just playing the game normally, I've farmed probably upwards of like 100 uniques so far, including all of the resplendent sparks from the season journey, but I've gotten legitimately one of these rings, and I also don't even know where it's from because it was sent to me in the lost and found in my stash. So no idea where I got this, but they just all seem to be completely randomly rolled and absurdly rare. But using this method in this video, you actually have a much higher chance to get any of these more rare uniques. And the main thing we are going to be using for this method that will allow you to target farm any unique item in the game is using the upgrade to unique recipe in the Haradra cube. Now, this recipe I think is heavily underused by a lot of players because I think people don't realize how good this can actually be. Now, what this is you're taking any white item and turning it into a unique. It has to be a common or white item, and all it takes is 10 raw primordial dust, which is an auto pickup item that you get from basically anything in the game. I think I have like 100,000 of these, so this resource is basically non-existent. You won't really ever run out of it. The main thing you may run out of are enhanced primordial dust, which is a unique crafting material, but this shouldn't really be too hard to target farm if you run out of these. A really good way to actually target farm this is to run any nightmare dungeon that has the materials chest affix on it. I think it's called materials reserve. This will spawn those chests all over the nightmare dungeon. You open them, it'll give you just a ton of random materials, a ton of which are the more rare materials for the cube. These enhanced primordial dust pretty commonly drop out of these, so just doing a handful of nightmare dungeons with that affix on it and you'll probably get a good chunk of this material as well. And outside of these materials, you obviously need the common items, which you are always going to want to make sure are ancestral, because if you use a non-ancestral common item, it will turn it into a non-ancestral unique. So make sure it's an ancestral white item that will always make it an ancestral unique. It won't always make it have greater affixes, but it'll always be ancestral for the higher item level, and then it can also have greater affixes on it. Now, at this point, you may be thinking that you haven't come across a ton of ancestral white items in the game, especially once you get further into the end game. But I think a lot of people are forgetting about the remove affix craft in your Haradra cube, which is going to be the second part of this. So remove affix, you could take a magic or rare item, you take 1 refined primordial dust and 15 raw primordial dust, and you can remove an affix from an item. This means you can take a magic or rare item and turn turn it into a white item. So if you take, say, an ancestral magic item, remove the affixes off it, it'll turn into a white and it will keep its ancestral tag that you can then turn into a unique item. This is generally pretty cheap. Refined primordial dust are pretty common to obtain. I think I'm sitting on like 600 right now and I've been using a bunch of them. And then again, with the raw primordial dust, you get that for basically everything, so you shouldn't run out of that. Now, if you try to do this for like thousands of items, yeah, you'll start running out of primordial dust pretty quickly. You can do legitimately hundreds of items. You probably have hundreds or 1,000 plus of this resource already. But as we'll go over in the method of obtaining these base items, you don't really want to be turning rare items into white items because that's always 3 affixes. Not only is that a lot of resources, but it's very annoying to do this to a bunch of items. So what I would recommend is you're going to be saving any ancestral white or magic items, because magic items can have either 1 or 2 affixes on them. A lot of the time they will only have 1 on them, so it'll only take 1 remove affix craft until they're a white item to turn into a unique. But you're asking, how do I go about farming white and magic ancestral items? Well, there's actually a very easy farm to do this and be very consistent and quite fast with it. And we are going to be farming obols, but we are going to be farming obols through nightmare dungeons with some specific talent points in the endgame skill tree, because if you do this in the method we'll go over in this video, you can legitimately get 10x the obols cap in a singular nightmare dungeon run. It's that crazy. So you'll be farming up all of these obols, and then you will just use the obols at the gambling vendor, and you will just buy the items you're looking for. And through these items you're buying, which because we're getting so many obols, you'll be able to get a lot of them, you will just save any magic or white ancestral item. You will turn all those into white items through the cube like we went over, then you'll turn all of those into uniques like we went over. Depending on what item you're buying from the vendor, you can pretty easily get like a full stash tab of white or magic ancestral items in like 30 minutes. It is so incredibly fast to do this. And you may have noticed that on Nightmare Dungeon sigils, you can get an obols affix on them. So it'll just add chests throughout your Nightmare Dungeon run. You open up, it'll drop you a ton of obols. But there's a few things with this. First off, it seems that for whatever reason, any of the chest affixes, so the material chests, the gold chests, the obols chests, any of those chests you can get in Nightmare Dungeons seem to give a lot more if they're part of an escalation Nightmare Dungeon sigil, which are the legendary sigils where you do 3 runs back to back to back, then you face Astaroth at the end. Now there's a handful of ways to obtain these. Any Nightmare Dungeon with the Heragic Strong Room affix in it, which you can also just randomly get in any Nightmare Dungeon. You do that, you defeat the boss in there with the chest at the end, quite a high chance to give you an escalation sigil. As we'll go over in the skill tree, there's also a node that can just give you escalation sigils from any Nightmare Dungeon boss, and then you can also just turn 5 of any Nightmare Dungeon sigil into an escalation sigil. And one of the nodes we'll be going over is also incredibly strong for this, because even if the escalation dungeon you start doesn't have the obol affix on it, you will have a very high chance of getting at least 1 obol affix during your escalation Nightmare Dungeon run. So no matter what you're doing, if you're running escalation sigils and using these nodes, you will be getting obols. So starting off, you really have to go down the middle tree of the Nightmare Dungeon skill tree. The first thing is Dread Arrival. Bosses in Nightmare Dungeons have a chance to revive when slain. This is actually a pretty good node for a couple reasons. First off, there are 2 different things in these dungeons that are considered bosses that we care about. First off, organically spawning butchers. So you've probably come across that when you go to Nightmare Dungeon, there's just a chance for a butcher to be somewhere in there. Anytime that is the butcher spawn, not a butcher being spawned from another node in any of the other endgame skill trees, just the randomly spawned organic butcher is considered a boss for a few different things. First off, Dread Revival seems to be able to respawn that butcher because he is considered a boss. The second thing is a mechanic I don't think some people have realized exists. Some of the nodes in Nightmare Dungeons will cause the boss in the Nightmare Dungeon to spew out that specific loot. So if you get a gold reserve affix on a Nightmare Dungeon and defeat the boss at the end, you'll notice that for the next 15 seconds, that boss is spewing out gold because it's essentially giving you the loot of the affix. This works with the obol affix. So if you get the obol affix in a Nightmare Dungeon and defeat a boss, it will spew out obols for like the next 10 to 15 seconds. The butcher, or specifically the organically spawning butcher, is considered that boss. So if you're in a Nightmare Dungeon with the obol's affix and you kill an organically spawning butcher, it will, the same way as the boss at the end of a Nightmare Dungeon, it will spew out obols like it's that boss. So you can legitimately get like obol's cap from killing a butcher in a Nightmare Dungeon with the obol's affix in it. And why this is so crazy is because with Dread Revival, both the butcher and the boss at the end that'll spew out absurd amounts of obols can now just respawn when you kill them. It's only a chance, but it happens pretty frequently. So killing a boss at the end of the dungeon with the obol's affix, and then that boss respawning and you killing it again, can legitimately give you multiple caps of obols. So legitimately like 5,000 obols. So just this first picture of this first node is pretty crazy, but it gets even crazier. Now the second node is bosses in Nightmare Dungeons have +1 monster power, which will just buff up their loot, and have a chance to drop an escalation sigil when slain. So now just killing any boss, including the butcher, will just have a chance to give you escalation sigils, just like the bosses in the Heraldic Strong Rooms. So now you'll never run out of escalation sigils and you'll get them pretty frequently. Now the final node is probably the most important. When advancing to the next dungeon in a Nightmare escalation, 2 additional Heraldic portals appear. So once you've completed a Nightmare dungeon, when you're in an escalation dungeon run, you defeat the boss at the end, instead of that one portal showing up to take you to the next dungeon that has the random affixes on it, it will be 3. Now what this does is just gives you more chances at the affixes you're looking for. All 3 of these portals will have randomized affixes, so it will give you a much better chance at getting treasure breach runs, and specifically for this, it'll give you a very, very high chance for one of those options to give you an obol affix to where you could just get more obols in the next stage of that escalation dungeon. And this occurs at every stage. So you start an escalation dungeon, you go defeat the boss at the end, you get your 3 portals to spawn. Every single one of those 3 options will have 2 affixes on them. So you have 6 different opportunities to getting the obol affix. Then you go through the next Nightmare dungeon, you defeat the boss at the end, 3 more of those portals will spawn. All 3 of those will have 3 affixes on them. So that's 9 more opportunities to get an obol affix. And just going through those first 3 dungeons, you will pretty much always have at least 1 opportunity for obols. More than likely you'll have multiple opportunities to get obols. And also going into the final phase, which is against Astaroth, that will also spawn 3 portals. Now this isn't specifically for obols, but it's just nice to also have options for what Astaroth is going to be dropping as well. And this only requires 3 points in Nightmare Dungeons. Now there are additional nodes you can get that can buff this up, like the first node on the left side of the tree. So the red side is Waking Spoils. After completing a Nightmare Dungeon, there will be a chest at the end that gives you more loot. This chest seems to always give you some amount of the affix as well. So if you're doing an obol run, that war chest at the end seems to always give you at least a little bit of additional obols. Then you also have the shrine affix, where when you pick up a shrine buff, anything you kill when you have the shrine buff active will respawn at the end. The reason I say this is because if you get lucky and get a organic butcher spawn next to a shrine, you can respawn the butcher. So you could potentially get ultra lucky. You could get an organic butcher next to a shrine, pick up the shrine buff, kill the butcher. That butcher could respawn because of the node we went over previously. So then it would be 2 butcher kills. Then the shrine would spawn both those butchers, and both those butchers I think may be able to respawn. I'm not sure if that specifically can happen. All of those butchers will act as a Nightmare Dungeon boss. So if you have an obol sigil when you get that lucky, all of those butchers will just drop a ton of obols as well. So there's some crazy stuff you can do with that as well. The most necessary things for doing this farm are the 3 middle nodes. So as you're doing this, you're just going to be going back to town, using your obols on the items you're looking for. Again, you're going to be saving all of the magic and white ancestral items. Just throw them in your stash if you have space. Then once you're done with that escalation sigil, go back to town, turn all of those into uniques, rinse and repeat doing this until you're out of the resource to turn items into uniques, or until you have the item you're looking for. And if you're just looking for a better rolled unique, this is also a very good way to farm for that. And it's an additional way to farming uniques if they specifically come from one of the layer bosses. So if you're looking for a more rare unique, this is very good. If you're looking to get a better roll for a specific unique, this is also very good. This will allow you to target farm literally every unique in the game. Even those rare uniques that aren't a dedicated drop from one of the layer bosses, you can still farm those because for most items, the pool of uniques isn't super big outside of things like rings. Rings are kind of the biggest pool, which if you're like me and looking for one of the rings, it's going to be a lot harder. But also rings at the gambling vendor for opals is only 50 a piece, and you'll be getting 2 per buy, so you can actually get a lot of rings overall. That's the entirety of the method to allow you to farm any unique in the game. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.